Hello, I'm Larry Blank, and this is From the Pit number 15. And today, as a guest, I have the formidable dance arranger, conductor, composer, orchestrator, arranger, David Chase. Welcome, David.
So good to be here. Thank you, Larry, for inviting me to be part of this.
Pleasure. How often do we get called formidable?
Uh, well, the funny thing about the word formidable is always makes me think of ants because I think it comes from the same Latin root. I'm not sure why or how, and I might be making this up, but I do a lot of that in my life. So when I hear formidable, I think of an army of ants just marching along. So,
Well, sometimes we're like that. I've said this before, but both two of my mentors, Erwin Costel and Ralph Burns,
hmm
didn't say we were ants. They said we were pigs, that we had to eat
yeah,
everything. But now I'd rather be a formidable ant than a hungry pig because it sounds terrible, doesn't it? And it sounds terrible that
they
I
both
mentioned
sound
that.
pretty bad. So, yeah.
Yeah, really sorry, but I'm so glad to have you here talking with me today because we both have been doing the same thing for a long time and on innumerable amount of shows. It seems like
hmm
um, uh, we you just keep getting hired, which is a good thing, but it's the amount of shows we've done and the amount of people we've worked with, which is what I really wanted to talk to you about. So much about I've talked a lot about being mentored and
hmm
about education and where we came from. And I thought maybe you'd speak a little bit about how you got into this business rather than the music business.
Yes. Well, I have a very circuitous route and unexpected route in that growing up, I don't think I knew anybody who was involved, who was a professional artist of any sort, a singer, a musician. I think of the organist at the church in Fairfax, Virginia, who actually was a secretary at the CIA, or the man who occasionally played piano, who was an Air Force lieutenant colonel. But it wasn't that people didn't do this for a living. The first person that I encountered who really gave me a taste of something special was my high school drama teacher, Joan Bettinger. And I'll tell a quick story about how I encountered her, which is that my mother, who I lost about 2 years ago, um, she was an incredibly social person. And she's driving down the street one day in the neighborhood, and she sees, and it's late afternoon. There's a kid walking along the side of the road, and being social, and this being 40 odd, 50, almost 50 years ago, she stops and asks him if he wants a ride home. And they get talking, and he talks so much about how he loves the drama department at the high school that I was a freshman. My mother came home and said, "You should get involved in the drama department." So I walked down the hall the next day, and I don't know what possessed me, but I found the drama teacher, Joan Bettinger, and said, "I play piano. Can I do something?" And she was so tickled by the sort of forward, unassuming nature that she said, "Sure, make up a part." They already had a pianist; they were doing Pippin. But I said, "Okay, I'll just figure something out." And that actually started a long journey of making stuff up, which is essentially what I still do. Um, but she was a huge influence. I ended up doing a lot of stuff on stage in high school and into college. I did things like, and this was of course highly illegal. We did cabaret my senior year of that's not what was illegal. We did cabaret legally my senior year of high school. And we all sat down to watch the movie at some point, and we all went, "But those are different songs, some of them, and those are different characters. So can we just, this is the illegal part, can we just like add those songs and add some of those characters?" And Joan Bettinger said, "Sure, why not? Just you figure out how to do it." So I transcribed and orchestrated, not very well, I'm sure. I don't have the charts anymore, but all of the things like "Don't Tell Mama" and "Maybe This Time," and we put them in the show, and nobody told us we couldn't. That's the illegal part. I did tell John Kander that story many, many years later, and he gave me permission in hindsight. So, but
Oh,
that's
that
that's
works
kind
then.
of
Yeah.
how, yeah, and that's kind of how I got started, because Joan Bettinger didn't say you can't do that, or how can you do that, or just said do it. So I did it. Um, in college, again, I didn't know anybody who went into music or theater professionally. It wasn't on my radar. I have a degree in biology, thinking that maybe I'd go to medical school. I continued to perform in college. I got involved with the Hasty Pudding Theatricals, where I sort of kind of wrote the music for 3 shows, except that looking back, what I was really doing was studying styles and creating pastiches based on trying to understand style. And that actually, again, I was arranging without knowing that that's what I was doing, using compositional tools to reformat and reframe storytelling. Music, I still don't really call myself a musician. I'm really, and I've said this in various places before, but I'm a storyteller and music is my tool. So that doesn't mean I'm not deeply musical and have over the years learned a lot about music, but I do have no formal training. I have about 5 years of piano lessons as a kid. I hated every second of it. I went through 3 different teachers because none of them knew what to do with me, because I would just make stuff up or do things like, when one of my piano teachers gave me a Scott Joplin rag, I learned it, and then I came back and said, yeah, but if I swing the eighths, it sounds very different. And they were like, you can't do that. That's not how it's written. It's like, yeah, but it's interesting if I do it. And I remember Claude Morrison was his name. His face turned beet red, and I thought his head was going to explode. But so wherever you are, Claude Morrison, I apologize. I continue to do different things to music, because it's fun and it achieves storytelling purposes. Um, the After college, I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I knew I did not want to become a doctor, or at least didn't want to go to medical school, which is not quite the same thing, but similar. But I could play piano. I had a good friend, Roger Grodsky, who retired recently as the head of music in the musical theater department at Cincinnati at CCM. He was in Boston at the time. He knew that they were looking for a sub pianist at Forbidden Broadway. So, sort of with the same energy of how I approached Joan Bettinger, I just showed up one day and said, I play piano. Can I be a sub? And ended up, that was, I sort of, I won't say tutored under, but I listened a lot to both Fred Barton and Brad Ellis, who were both monster pianists who had the philosophy, which I already had but didn't understand it, of when you're playing the piano, especially in a rehearsal or a piano only context, that you're really doing orchestral reductions for 2 hands. And it was always about, how do you try to make the piano sound like an orchestra in that context? And that was Forbidden Broadway, for those who don't know, is 1 piano and 4 singers singing known songs, but with parody or rewritten lyrics, at the time only by Gerard Alessandrini, and that commented on the current state of Broadway. So I learned about Broadway by first making fun of it, or gently prodding it. And the goal there was always listen to whatever the recording that came out and try to make the piano sound like that recording, which was always a full orchestra recording, or usually. And because Forbidden Broadway was closed in New York when I was doing it in Boston, all of the stuff that opened between basically 87, 88 into 89 on Broadway, we were the only people doing it. So all of the, if you go to Forbidden Broadway now, all the Les Mis material, all of the like Into the Woods, all of those things, those were all my arrangements, but I didn't know I was arranging them. I was just listening to the album and trying to figure out how to make it sound like that on the piano. I eventually, still not knowing what to do with my life, but still saying, I'll keep doing this until it's no longer fun. But it was still fun. I moved to New York in January of 90. one of the first people I encountered is someone that you know well, who was Don Pippin. There was Radio City was starting a new Easter show, or restarting. I guess they had done it at one point in the past. Scott Salmon was the director choreographer, and Don was the music director. The dance arrangers were Marvin Laird and Mark Hummel, and they had thought that they had secured the services of Richard Riskin as the rehearsal pianist, who had been the rehearsal pianist for La Cage aux Folles, which Scott and Don had done together. And it turned out that nobody had, somewhere the communication broke down. It was a Friday morning. Rehearsals are starting on Monday. They finally get a hold of Richard because nobody had reached out to him to say, you are doing this. And he said, no, I can't. So there was a mad scramble on this Friday morning to find a rehearsal pianist. And I was living in a little tiny apartment that I was sharing with a friend from college on 45th Street. I come home to the cassette player on the answering machine, and I hear, David Chase, this is Don Pippin. And he did have the lowest voice in show business.
He did.
But Don basically I finally eventually figured out where my name came up to him, and they had put out 1 million calls. I had just moved to the city, but I was subletting from someone who knew someone who knew someone who was working with somebody who was working on the Radio City show. So just out of the blue, I got this call saying, come over to the stage door at Radio City and come up to the 9th floor and come play for us. So I did. It was Marvin Laird working on something at the piano, and he sat down and said, or he was playing, he said, can you play this? And I just sat down and played it, and they went, great, you're hired starting Monday. So that's how I got started in New York. It's how I got my union card, because the contractor at Radio City at the time was a gentleman named Bob Swan. Bob Swan had been a timpanist for many years, but as he got older, his perfect pitch slipped by half step, and he couldn't stand to play anymore because everything sounded like it was a half step off. So he was the contractor there. He came to me at the first break and said, what's your union card number? And I said, what's a union? So he basically sent me to the union over lunch break, and that's how I joined 802. But Don, talking about mentors, Don was really the first, and I knew his name because I had done enough, I won't say research, but in preparation for moving to New York, I looked up, found people that collected playbills, and I wrote down every name in the playbill in the music department, whether it was the conductor or the arranger, the dance arranger, or the vocal arranger, or the orchestrator, or even, I always looked in the back for the rehearsal pianist, and I'd written I'm sure I wrote down the name Larry Blank several times at that point. This is 89, 90. But and also having done Forbidden Broadway for so long in Boston, we were visited constantly by tours. So I got to know a fair number of people who toured through Boston. And then one person who was very instrumental at the time to me was Philip Fortenberry, who is a marvelous pianist, lives in Las Vegas now. Famously was the hands of Liberace for the TV, actually was the player for the TV miniseries of Liberace. And Philip was reopening Forbidden Broadway in New York, so he came and hung with me in Boston. And then every time I visited New York, I remember I went to see, I can't remember what the show was, something when he was subbing, and so he was very instrumental in helping me. But the person that really, I would say, changed the course of my career was James Raitt. And I don't know Larry, if you ever knew James. So James was, for those who recognize the last name, yes, he's John Raitt's nephew, Bonnie Raitt's cousin. James was a brilliant musician and a very funny man. He's probably best known now as having been the original music director and arranger of Forever Plaid. He also did an off-Broadway show called Pageant. He was for many years the pianist for American Dance Machine. He worked on 2 and eventually 3 Broadway shows. The When I met him, ended up playing auditions for Pageant, when they were looking for get their first swing, or I guess hired their second swing, um, and during a break, he just said, "Hey, what are you doing next week?" He was looking for someone to play a week of Forever Plaid, which was running. And again, I was fairly new to town, and so basically, I learned Forever Plaid in a week and ended up doing it off and on in various places for about a year and a half. And then in summer of '93, or early summer, late spring, and I had done a bunch of projects with James over the years, or over those couple of years, 91, 92. So now we're at 93. And I remember I was down at his apartment, and he said, "I've been asked to music direct Damn Yankees on Broadway and to do new arrangements." And it was the idea was that it would be very much similar to the Forever Plaid aesthetic of sort of mid to late 50s, close harmony, just sort of celebrating all of that very sophisticated, what you might call the bachelor pad music style or space age bachelor pad style of music. But he also told me that at that time that he was very ill. Now, I had no intention up to this point of becoming a conductor at all. I loved playing the piano. In fact, I turned down the national tour of the music of Andrew Lloyd Webber because they asked me to play synth, and I went, "I don't like playing synth." And Mel Rodden, who was a contractor, the last thing he said to me was, "Don't say that, you'll never work." And he's right, he never hired me again. But I didn't want to play synth. I liked playing piano. But James said, "You know what? I'm very ill. I'm going to take this job as the music director of Damn Yankees, and I want you to be my associate. I want you to learn to conduct." And he said, because I'm not going to be around very long. He was ill with AIDS, as were many of the men of that generation. So he literally passed the baton to me, and I don't have it here, but that is his baton is the only baton I ever used to conduct.
Oh. And yeah, I remember all of this and all the names you're mentioning, of course, because I was crossing around at the same time. And I remember James, and I met him when he was with the American Dance Machine. So.
Well, he was a fantastic pianist. He had a fantastic sense of humor and unbelievably good ears. And he was actually a real mentor to the sort of Forever Plaid group. It was me, it was Seth Rudetsky, who's very much found his niche these days. It was Rob Bowman, who went on to become the music director of Chicago, or music supervisor, I guess now. I'm not eventually, or I'm not sure exactly what the title is. And importantly, Doug Besterman. And so when when Damn Yankees came up, James said, "Here, David, here's your gift. Become a conductor. Here, Doug, here's your gift. Here's your first Broadway show to orchestrate." And it set Doug and I off on our careers, really. And this was fall of '93 at the Old Globe, and then we opened in Broadway in March of '94. And James, the quick sort of wrapping that up is that he did realize his dream of conducting an orchestra on Broadway. He did it for what at the time is called the Gypsy Run, the invited dress. That was a Sunday night. We had a Monday night preview he conducted, a Tuesday night preview he conducted, and after Tuesday's show, he said, "I want you to conduct tomorrow's matinee. I'll sit out and take notes." So I did. I looked for him afterwards, got a note saying he didn't make it, conduct tonight. And this went on for another week or so. And we opened March 4th. He did not make it back into the theater, except for one meeting, and he died in late April. So I said,
I remember the
But
time.
I consider, in fact, I mean, with that show, James died, the associate director died around the same time. The original PSM died around the same time, or a little later. But so, I mean, it was a very touching. I mean, there were so many wonderful people lost, and not just for their own talents, but also for the fact that there was a whole bridge that was lost. So you look at someone like Chris Chapman, the choreographer, who was the bridge from Fosse to another generation. He was lost. That, you still have people. I think of the Wayne Salentos and the Graziella Daniels who are bridging from that previous generation, but there aren't very many. And that's true in the musical theater world. I mean, in the conducting world as well. There aren't that many people who are sort of literally passing the baton, literally and figuratively.
I of course remember the same time you were talking about Don Pittman, Scott Salmon, and all that, and Richard Riskin.
Mm-hmm.
Richard and I go
Mm-hmm.
back to music fairs days in the 70s.
Oh, mm-hmm.
And he also assisted me on Locage because I conducted the West Coast Company because of Don Pittman,
Mm-hmm.
and Richard was my assistant there. And of course, many from that cast passed on, also many from Chorus Line that I had done before that. Oh, all the people we're talking about from that era, just, it was a shocking time. Lost a lot of friends and a lot of very important people in the industry, choreographers, conductors, dancers, performers. Terrible time.
Terrible time. And we've, I think, forgotten it, or at least the current generation has, not to sound like an old fogey, but it's, I think it feels like the distant past. But at the same time, I think about, if I moved to New York in '90, so that's 34 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
If, what would I think of people talking about 1956 in 1990?
Right.
That was distant history.
Mm-hmm. Same thing for me because I did Chorus Line in 1977, and
wow.
Locage was 1984, and it's 40 years ago. So
Yeah.
Well, and those were the people that trained us and passed on the batons.
Yeah. Well, and I will say that just to spend a moment on Chorus Line, it was very important to me at that time in my life. I ended up doing it here and there. I did it at Paper Mill Playhouse as the I was the associate conductor. No, that was before the James story, but I wasn't interested in conducting. I was interested in playing the piano. But that's where I met my wife, Paula, who had been in Chorus Line on Broadway. And then that Chorus Line Broadway closed in '90. She went on the road for 6 months, came back, and it sort of coincided with when Paper Mill lost a swing at the last minute. So she came into that company, and we started dating maybe a year later when she had just opened Crazy for You on Broadway. And we got married within 4 or 5 months of dating, and we've been married now for almost 32 years.
That's fantastic.
So we are in the back of that Chorus Line history book of couples who met doing Chorus Line. So
just to share with you, my assistant on the 1977 tour was Eddie Strauss.
Oh, fantastic.
So Eddie was the pianist, and of course he then went on to conduct a whole bunch of shows. So there's a whole history back there from Chorus Line that we all moved on together, and all the dancers.
Well, this is something singers. I tell, whether it's performers or music directors or people when they're starting in the business, is that look around at the people that are your generation. They're the people you're going to grow with, and that you're going to collaborate with and learn things together. Not that you shouldn't aim to work with everybody, but look at the people around. I think about in that first Radio City company at the Easter show, Rob Ashford was in the ensemble. Christopher Gattelli was in the ensemble. At Paper Mill, the chorus line, that chorus line, Bobby Longbottom was playing Bobby, who I ended up working with quite a bit. I was, because I was both courting Paula and hanging around and started subbing Crazy for You. That's how I also got to know Casey Nicolau. And through Damn Yankees, which was choreographed by Rob Marshall, his associate was Kathleen. And so as the associate conductor, a music director originally, I spent a lot of time with the associate choreographer, rehearsing, teaching things, doing auditions. And so much of my career has been with Kathleen, with Rob Ashford, with Casey, with Chris, with people that basically we all grew up together at the same time. Now I'll go back to Eddie Strauss. You mentioned I had a couple of interactions with Eddie that were all quite lovely. The first show I ever subbed on Broadway was the Guys and Dolls, the Jerry Zaks Guys and Dolls that Eddie conducted. And Larry Yerman was the associate there. And Larry asked me to be his first sub, and I ended up subbing there, playing rehearsals, playing auditions. So I got to know Eddie pretty well. And my first dance arranger specific job, not as the music director, who was also the dance arranger, was for the revival of Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum that Eddie conducted, that Rob Marshall, who knew me from Damn Yankees, because I ended up doing, here's the quick, Damn Yankees was a bit of a, I won't say a mess. It was a fantastic experience, but there was a lot of stuff early on that happened. Jack O'Brien, as far as I know, was always the director, but the original choreographer was not Rob Marshall. I won't get into why or anything. And that choreographer had hired Tom Fay to be the dance arranger, who, Tom Fay's a name I think a lot of people don't know, but probably best known for the Anything Goes revival at Lincoln Center. Tom and Rob, and eventually Rob Marshall took over as the choreographer. Tom and Rob, I won't say they didn't get along, but it wasn't a perfect marriage. And Tom left before the show finished in San Diego. So I ended up, that was actually my first time we're doing dance music, even though I didn't know that's what I was doing, but there was a vacuum there. So I stepped in, and worked therefore with Rob Marshall quite a bit on that show. By the time it got to New York and James was ill, it was clear I basically, starting with rehearsals, took over as the full-time music director running rehearsals, and James would come in for an hour at the end of each day. And Rob said, I think we need to bring in somebody to help with the dance music, just because you have so many responsibilities on your plate. And David Crane came in to that show. So that's how I got to know David Crane as well. But I can remember during Forum, going to Eddie's apartment, which was a very small apartment because he wanted to talk about just the music and the concept. But I remember he had the most gigantic bass woofers I've ever seen in my life in this tiny apartment, because it was very important to him to have the highest possible fidelity when listening to music. So
yes, I have to tell you something very funny about Eddie. When we were doing Chorus Line, very diligent pianist, as you know, and a very solid guy, good guy. Whenever we did the tap dance at the end of Chorus Line, da 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 da, the orchestra would be playing, and Eddie would smile at me and start playing Old Man River against it. and of course, nobody would hear it except us in the pit. We were just dying with laughter. But that was Eddie. He was a marvelous pianist and good guy. Good guy. Yeah. Matter of fact, you just triggered a little memory. The first time I met Eddie, I did a bus and truck tour of the Me Nobody Knows when I was 17 or 18. Wow. He was the music director on Broadway, and I learned the show from him. And the second show I took over on Broadway was Very Good Eddie at the Booth Theater. And I took it over from Eddie Strauss just for a 2-week vacation. And then later on, he was my associate. And I'll share this with you and our audience just because it's funny. I did a string of flop shows in a row on Victoria, Copperfield, Colette, right in a row. And I was standing with him in front of the Alvin Theater, the Neil Simon, when he was doing Merrily We Roll Along. And I was standing with Milton Rosenstock, one of the great conductors of Broadway, who just happened to be there at the same time we knew each other. And Eddie, this is wicked, turned to me and said, "You should be conducting the show." And I said, "Why do you say that?" And he said, "Because it's going to close next week." So my bad story about Merrily We Roll Along. But that was his sense of humor.
That's very funny. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it was.
I'll also mention another name that was very, another person who was very helpful to me at that time was Peter Howard.
Me too. Yeah.
And I met Peter. I was still in Boston, and I remember it was the opening gala celebration of the Worcester Foothills Theater, or I guess it's the Foothills Theater, but it's a new theater in Worcester, Mass. And so the Boston Company of Forbidden Broadway was there to perform some things. And P.S., by the way, the Boston Company of Forbidden Broadway, for most of the time I was in Boston, was extraordinary. It was Michael McGraw, dearly departed, his eventual wife, Tony DeBono, Karen Murphy, and then a series of different people in the the second male role, the other role. A lot of other very talented people, but those three, basically, we did the show for 2 or 3 years almost straight, the four of us, and then a revolving door of fourth person or fourth singer, but extraordinary talents. So we were at the Worcester Foothills Theater for the opening gala. There was also various other people there I remember Davis Gaines was there singing the title song from the new musical Peg, which I know nothing else about. I'm not even sure it ever made it to Broadway.
I think it did.
But did it? The other person who was there was Peter Howard, who was there with with Leroy Reams and a group of, I think, maybe 10 or 12 tap dancers from 42nd Street. Now, Peter wasn't, to my knowledge, specifically associated with 42nd Street, but for whatever reason, he was there. And again, because I had been making my little list, I knew that name, Peter Howard, and I knew that he was a dance arranger, but I didn't really know what a dance arranger was. So at the party after this gala, I sought him out and just said, and introduced myself and said, "What's a dance arranger?" And I wish I had written down or recorded. I remember it being like, "Oh, I've never even thought of that. That sounds fantastic." And I especially love that there he was surrounded by all these dancers, and that it seemed like a very different kind of existence to being, whether being an orchestrator, being alone in a room like a medieval monk hunched over, making little dots on the page. When you're a dance arranger, you get to be in the room and make it right there when it's happening. And you're surrounded by these, people with incredible physical abilities, and you're shaping things. And I never wanted to be a composer, but I loved using, again, compositional tools to manipulate music to help tell stories. And I got to know Peter once I moved to New York. So that would have been 88 or 89. Moved to New York in 90, got to know him when I was sort of around Crazy for You. And it turned out he lived 3 doors down on 55th Street. Small side note, utter coincidence, my college roommate bought his apartment.
Really?
And now lives in Peter Howard's apartment, which I had been in. And it was and he knew it was Peter Howard's apartment. He's somebody who's a fantastic writer about theater, but that's not his day job is in the corporate world. But yeah, so he lives in Peter Howard's old apartment, which I always,
Let me share something with you.
yeah.
I knew Peter as well from early on because Don Pippin introduced me to him. So
Hmm.
Peter actually helped me get one of my first summer stock jobs at the Kenley Players. He recommended me for that because I knew him from about the time I was 16 or 17.
Hmm.
But in 1977, my phone rang and it was Peter. And he said, Larry, I'm in rehearsals for a new show. My pianist didn't work out and I need a new assistant. Would you like to do it? And the name of the show was Annie.
Oh.
And I said, Peter, 1 hour ago, I got the call to conduct the International Company of Chorus Line. And he said, you absolutely must take it. And I don't need to have you as
Hmm.
an assistant on this show. He said, I think it's going to be a big hit. And it had
Hmm.
been at good speed. And I recommended my good friend, Bob Billick. So
Hmm.
Bob was originally the pianist on Annie because of that.
Oh,
And
I didn't know that. Okay.
yeah, I was always grateful to Peter for even asking
Hmm.
me to do it. And we remained friends, of course, but we never actually worked together. And I
Oh, how
am
funny.
friendly occasionally with his son Jason on Facebook.
Hmm. It's
So
marvelous.
just
Here's a
you
side
know,
story. Yeah.
yeah,
Side story about Bob Billig, which is his apartment is somewhere in, I want to say, the West 80s or 70s, maybe.
'70s, yeah.
And he 70s. He's lived there so long that when he moved in with a grand piano, or he moved in and had a grand piano or acquired a grand piano, then they rebuilt the building and the hallways and the doors. He will never be able to get the grand piano out of the apartment. So
Because
he
of
said,
that.
I guess I have to stay here. Um, but there's always windows and cranes, I guess. Um, but to go back to Peter Howard for a second, Peter was very kind, and I always, even though I didn't know him terribly well, I I feel a kinship to him because I think of historically, he's the person that I'm most aware of who had sort of a split career between being a conductor, music director, and being a dance arranger, where he would be very happy to be the dance arranger for a different conductor. He'd be very happy to be a music director with a different dance arranger. Be very happy to do both, and that's very much what my career has been as well. And I consider myself lucky um, in that I've gotten to work as a dance arranger with many different music directors and learned by watching, been able to lend my experience as a music director without impinging on what they are doing as music directors as well. The other thing I'll mention about Peter is that I'm going to back up to a little bit of a history lesson, which I expect but I'm going to repeat anyway because I like talking about a woman named Trudy Rittman.
Of
So,
course.
so Trudy Rittman, and I've never met her, but as far as I'm concerned, she is the most important woman in the 20th century of American musical theater. That is a very strong statement, but here's why. There was no such thing as a dance arranger before 1944, no, 43, somewhere in there. If you had dance music in a Broadway show, it was almost always routined by the choreographer and maybe a rehearsal pianist, and then orchestrated by the orchestrator. And when I say routined, it would be laid out. And my dear departed friend Bruce Pomahack used to always use as a great example the dance of Johnny One Note from Babes in Arms, which is a 6-minute long dance of Johnny using the theme of Johnny One Note. It never changes key. It never develops. There are no transitions. It simply plays the song in different styles. So the routining was, okay, we're going to do the A section in light swing. Then we're going to do the second A in stop time. Then we're going to do the B section in this style. And that's basically what the dance arrangement, such as it existed, was. Now, you always had exceptions, like when Richard Rodgers did, the Slaughter on 10th Avenue for On Your Toes. That was a composed piece of music. That was a dance, but it was a composed piece of music. So now, cut to essentially Oklahoma, and Rodgers and Hammerstein, as part of their let's remake the concept of musical theater, brought in Agnes DeMille as choreographer. And Agnes DeMille assumed that Richard Rodgers was going to write a ballet like Slaughter on 10th Avenue. But for a variety of reasons, the most sort of plausible being they just didn't like each other, Rodgers didn't want to be in the room with Agnes DeMille. And so she worked out the entire ballet of Oklahoma with a rehearsal pianist. And if you look at that ballet, it is not a dance arrangement. It is a routine. And as Bruce Pomahak would point out, there are maybe 8 bars that are different from anything else in the show. And if you look at those 8 bars, it's something which they've nicknamed the waves. It's basically like it's like a piano kind of just playing arpeggiated figures. It's not a development of any theme. Otherwise, the Oklahoma ballet, Dream Ballet, is just, we're going to play this song, then we're going to play this song, and then we're going to play this song. And there's almost nothing in terms of development, or it just changes styles. And Robert Russell Bennett, who orchestrated it, I'm sure watched the tone of what was being danced and adjusted the orchestration and did things differently, but there's no arrangement. So for the next show, Rodgers and Hammerstein, which was Carousel, that Rodgers and Hammerstein did, they again asked Agnes DeMille, and Agnes DeMille said, okay, this time I'm bringing somebody to help me. And that somebody was Trudy Rittman, who was whose family had fled Europe in the 30s. She was a composer primarily, but she was making money as a pianist in the ballet and connected with Agnes DeMille. Agnes DeMille brought her in to be her pianist for One Touch of Venus, I think. Mm-hmm. And based on that experience, said, I want you to come and do Carousel with me. And when you look at what Trudy Rittman did in Carousel, it's mind-boggling. And I would say 99% of people have no idea, but the Carousel Ballet is an entirely different piece of work that is, yes, it's reliant on the Rodgers themes. It plays If I Loved You pretty much straight through. But when it gets to the pas de deux, what Trudy Rittman does musically, and here's the very short version, is she takes the phrase, I wonder what he'll think of me, from the top of Soliloquy, which is in a minor key, and puts it in a major key, puts it in 6/8, and makes it romantic, da 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 dum, da 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 dum, and turns it into something entirely different. Uses compositional tools to create, to take the germ of something musically and develop it in the way that a composer would. And that makes that the first real dance arrangement.
I have to tell you something that I know about Trudy Rittman. Aside from all the wonderful things she did in other shows, mm-hmm. including all the creative stuff in Sound of Music, da 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 da, that's all hers.
Yeah, right.
Jack Lee told me a story that Julie Stein told him when they were doing the original Peter Pan in 1954. Trudy was the dance arranger mm-hmm. for Jerry Robbins. And there were all these animal ballets. And one day, they brought Julie Stein in to add additional material to Mark Charlotte and Carolyn Lee's score. Mm-hmm. So one day, Julie came in with a song called Distant Melody. And he played it for everybody. And Jerry Robbins turned to him and said, what is that you did with Trudy's dance music? And apparently it was her dance music for the, giraffe or something, became Distant Melody. And Julie admitted it and paid her off for that.
Oh,
But to
wow.
extrapolate a little bit further, not about Trudy Rittman, just about what you were
Hmm.
saying about arrangements for dance music. Irv Kostal told me that his career actually began on Broadway when Don Walker used to call him to ghost on various shows,
Hmm.
along with Red Ginsler. And he got a call on a show called Hazel Flag, which was a flop show, which starred Helen Gallagher. And this was from Don Walker the night before the orchestra rehearsal, and said, Irv, we have a dance number that hasn't been written. And Irv said, what is it? And Don said, it's 16 bars of jazz, it's 32 bars of waltz, it's 28 bars of circus music. Then there's a chase for 64 bars. And then there's 12 bars of cha-cha, and then it goes to an ending. And we prefer that you use songs from the show. That was the great comment. And he said they sent
That's
over a stack of sheet music. And that was it.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
That's exactly, yeah, routine it like this. I mean, I guess by the time of Hazel Flag, you're dealing with a much more complicated approach to dance music than just play
Yeah.
this one song for 6 minutes. But um, you also see that, by the way, the original Pal Joey dance music is just playing the song.
It's choruses, yeah.
But when they revived it in 1950, there was a dance arranger who came in and sort of applied all the Trudy Rittman tricks. That was Oscar Kasarin, who
Right.
is famously the uncle of Michael Cosrin.
He's the great uncle of Michael
Great
Cosrin.
uncle, sorry, great uncle.
Great
Yes.
uncle, yes.
But so to go back to Trudy, then I think because of the success of what happened with what she did, she ended up getting introduced to, like when Brigadoon happened, Agnes Mill wanted to bring her in. Fritz Lowe said, no, I don't want somebody else. So if you look at Brigadoon, Trudy's credit is special assistant to Mrs. DeMille, or Miss DeMille, whatever. She was the dance arranger, but not credited. Once Fritz Lowe saw what she did, they were inseparable, and she did every other Lerner and Lowe show.
Yes.
I might have my history a little bit off, but
no, you're right. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
And she did do every other Rodgers and Hammerstein show, with the notable exception of Flower Drum Song. I think, for anybody who really wants to understand what she did, look at the Small House of Uncle Thomas ballet in King and I.
It's amazing.
That is entirely her work, with the exception of about 16 bars where she sort of quotes Hello, Young Lovers, which is the ice skating dance. But the manner in which she quotes it is so unique and transformative that that you can you recognize that it's related to Hello, Young Lovers, but it is transformative. So, and as you mentioned, Trudy wrote she wrote all the Nun music and Sound of Music, except for the counterpoint, How Do You Solve a Problem Like Marie at the Wedding. She wrote all of the material, that the vocal stuff that the kids did with Do Re Mi, all of that back and forth. Everything, all of the vocal arranging in that song is in that show is Trudy Rittman.
I also saw Clear Day, and there was in the original Clear Day there was a gigantic ballet, long cut from the show and further productions, called At the Hellrakers, which was like 8 minutes long, and she wrote all of it.
Well, I believe it. But one of the reasons I go back to her is that so she was around My Fair Lady. Do you know who the assistant to the conductor on My Fair Lady was?
I do. You tell him. I do know.
Peter Howard.
That's
Peter
right.
Howard.
And he coached Rex Harrison as well.
Yes. And then she worked on Sound of Music. And do you know who the associate music director of Sound of Music was?
Peter Howard.
Peter Howard. So
here's one. I was just going to tell you one other. When I was 10 years old, my sister took me to see a show called No Strings. It originally opened at the 54th Street Theater, no longer there, but it was at the Broadhurst. And at the end of the show, the entire orchestra was brought on stage to play because they were not in the pit. And I noticed this pianist playing the conductor piano. It was one of the few shows that had a conductor piano. The original conductor of the show was Pete Matz, whose assistant was Milton Green, who later did Fiddler. But Milton Green took over the show, and the assistant conductor was Peter Howard. When I saw the show, Peter came at the end of the show, and years later when I met him, I said, "Boy, didn't you do No Strings?" And indeed he had. So sorry to interrupt you.
Well,
just
no,
goes on.
I'll go back. So one of the reasons I went back to Trudy Rittman is that I imagine a young Peter Howard sitting sort of listening to what Trudy Rittman is doing, learning all of these things, and then starting to apply it. His first huge thing is the opening of Carnival, which is very much a Trudy Rittman style of arrangement, where it's using themes and developing them. And then I sort of sat getting steeped in Peter Howard by being around Crazy for You a lot. So I feel a kinship to Trudy once removed through Peter Howard. The other names that I'll mention, just because people don't know them, the other great dance arranger, primarily the 40s into the 50s, was another woman named Genevieve Pitot, who had a very different, where Trudy Rittman was the sort of classically based Jewish European descent, thinking in classical terms. Genevieve Pitot was from New Orleans and from the jazz tradition. And so you sort of had these two somewhat opposite traditions, these two women both writing dance music, and Pitot worked a lot with Michael Kidd. So a show that probably never will be revived is Little Abner, but the dance music for the Sadie Hawkins Ballet is extraordinary.
Spectacular.
And it's Pitot basically using and manipulating. It's the first time that I'm aware consciously of somebody saying, "Oh, this character of using leitmotifs. This character gets this theme as they're going across. This character gets this theme. These themes interact," and how everything is manipulated and tells the story with melodic fragments. But she did a lot with Michael Kidd. She did, I think, famously Can Can, where Cole Porter loved her dance music so much that it's her music that opens the overture.
Yep. The quadrille.
The quadrille.
And Don Sadler used to rave. Donald Sadler, the choreographer, raved about Pitot. To me, I was asking him, he did, a whole stack of shows in the 50s, and she was always on it. He insisted on her. And
I didn't know that. Great. Okay.
He said that it was a problem because on several shows, everybody was going Pitot, Pitot after dance music, and the composers would very often get quite pissed off.
That's funny.
Which
then there was the other. Go ahead.
I was just going to say the other dance arranger. I don't know who you're going to mention about, but one I heard a lot from was Roger Adams of that time.
I was going to come to him. Before I get to Roger Adams, I'm going to mention the other woman that nobody knows is Betty Wahlberg.
Yes.
And Betty Wahlberg, it's actually hard to find her credits and figure out exactly what she did, except that she did Fiddler, and she did West Side Story, and she did Gypsy.
And Anyone Can Whistle.
And Anyone Can Whistle. So she was sort of famously joined at the hip with Jerome Robbins for a long period of time. But the nature of those shows, it's so, and this goes to as opposed to the Trudy Rittman or the Genevieve Pitot sort of, I'm going to, when it gets to the ballet, it's clearly a different voice, although it's still within the language of the rest of the score. Betty Wahlberg's voice is not apparent. And I take that in a weird way as a huge compliment, because it is our job as dance arrangers to not point at ourselves, for people to think that the composer wrote everything. So it's a very hard, you can't really, like the average audience member should walk out of the theater going, yeah, but what did you do?
Mm-hmm.
Because it should feel like the composer, like it's of a piece. And not to say that what Trudy or Genevieve did wasn't of a piece, very much of a piece, but I'm fascinated by Betty Wahlberg, who I can't even, in my knowledge of how things develop, I can't even point to exactly what she did. I will say I had a wonderful conversation several years ago with John Kander, who many people may or may not know. He has 2 dance arranger credits, the first being Gypsy, the second being Irma la Douce. And the reason that he was, so here's the quick story, which is that talking about Peter Matz, John and Peter were very much of the same generation, were good friends. They both wanted to be composers, but were making a living as conductors or arrangers or music directors. And John was out of town conducting something. I think he said it was in Philadelphia. And Peter had just seen a show in previews, and he reaches out to John and says, you have to get a ticket for this show. You have to go see it. It's unlike anything else. So John, next time he's in New York, he goes to the box office, buys a ticket, happens to be for opening night of West Side Story. And so as part of being at the opening night, he gets a ticket to the opening night party. He's trying to get a drink, can't get to the bar. The guy in front of him says, hey, what do you want? I'll get it for you. Turns out to be the pianist for the show. They strike up a conversation. And John comes in as he's the first sub at West Side Story. So
Joe Lewis was the pianist. Yeah.
Joe Lewis was, yes. So here's John Kander. It's funny to think of him young, subbing at West Side Story. And so Joe took a leave of absence to do something else at some point. John then became the de facto rehearsal pianist, got known by Ruth Mitchell, who was the PSM, who passed his name on to Jerome Robbins. So we get to Gypsy, and Jerome Robbins is working with Betty Wahlberg. Betty Wahlberg apparently has a really bad case of something that's like making her arm freeze up. I don't know if it was what it was. For whatever reason, she was unable to play the piano, and so they needed to bring in. She had already done some of the work. They needed to bring in somebody else. So Ruth Mitchell suggested Jerome Robbins help with this young kid, John Kander. So John Kander came in, and by that point, most of what was left to be done was all the Newsboys material. And also the Let Me Entertain You, which if you listen to the Let Me Entertain You vamp, you go, well, of course that's John Kander. It just shouts John Kander. So, and then based on that, he did Irma la Douce, which if you listen to, I mean, that's a fairly obscure show, but there's something called the Penguin Ballet, which you listen to, and that is unmistakably John Kander. And the big irony of all of this is you get to Chicago, and the Hot Honey Rag, which sounds totally like John Kander, is not. It's Peter Howard.
And here's some more little tie-in for you. You know who the pianist was in Irma la Douce?
I don't.
Don Pippin was the pit pianist.
Okay.
And he and John were old friends. But Pippin told me there was a show called The Amazing Adele in the 50s, which starred Tammy Grimes and unfortunately closed out of town. And the music department was musical continuity by Don Pippin. Dance rehearsal pianists were Peter Howard and John Kander. And Peter Matz did the vocal arrangements.
Wow.
They were all buddies working together from Summerstock, where their mentor was Oscar Kosarin.
Amazing.
All the names you mentioned. They were
yes. Here's another quick Don Pippin story that just popped in my head. He told me that he was not involved in the musical Shenandoah, which was a somewhat obscure, I guess, musical from the mid-'70s. Peter Udell and Gary
Gary
I
Geld.
can't remember.
Yes.
Geld.
Right.
I knew it because I played the lead Papa Charlie in high school, my junior year of high
Of
school, with
course.
my hair
Of
spray
course you
painted
did.
silver. Of course I did. Um, and I orchestrated it because it's a long story, but because Joan Bettinger, my high school teacher, said, well, we can't afford to rent a musical both in the fall and the spring. So if we're going to do a musical in the fall, you'll have to write all the orchestra parts. Now, I later found out, of course, she rented it, but it was to say you have. So I did. That was my first full show orchestration. And thank goodness that score had lots of notations in it about, who was playing what. But it turned, so Don Pippin was not involved directly in Shenandoah, but at least in his telling, it's the Monday after opening. They're recording the cast album. There's a song in the show which is very much it's called I've Heard It All Before, and it has a very it has a piano continuo sort of figure that's and for whatever reason they're in the recording studio, or maybe it's the night before, and the music director is realizing that the pianist just can't hack it and calls Don, and so that's Don playing piano on the Shenandoah cast album with one day's
I
notice.
I believe Don stayed on and played a few weeks in the pit because of it. He
Oh,
didn't
did
want
he?
anyone
Okay.
to know, because he was very well established as a conductor. And I once asked him about it. He said Mac and Mabel had closed, and a while,
Mm-hmm.
and he said he needed the pension contribution.
Well, that makes sense. So now I will return to Roger Adams, who you mentioned.
Yes.
Um, Another name that nobody knows, but anybody who knows Pajama Game or Damn Yankees, all of that fantastic dance music is Roger Adams. Roger Adams. So I did a deep dive trying to find stuff out. In fact, I think that was one of the times I talked to you, was to find stuff out about Roger Adams. I found out that his mother was a young French woman who happened to play violin, but also was in the Follies. And
Singer.
so she was,
Oh,
and a singer.
Odette
Okay.
Mertiel. Yeah.
Odette. And remember that name, because we'll come back to it. But that she was Paris based, ended up in London for something, met, I believe his name was Harry Adams, who was a British vaudeville performer or music hall performer. They had a brief and, by all accounts, unhappy marriage, but it produced a son, Roger. Eventually, Odette found her way to New York, where she was hired by Ziegfeld. She did that for a little bit and then retired to New Hope, Pennsylvania, and opened the restaurant Odette's, which is still going and still famous for its piano bar. Roger, therefore, born and raised in this very, literally in a trunk, ended up becoming a phenomenal dance arranger with a fairly short career. Basically, he was Fosse's person for the first half of the 50s. He disappeared for a few years, came back and did Mame, and a handful of other things. I want to say 1776. Is that right? No, that was
No,
Peter
that was
Howard.
Peter. But he
That
also
was Peter.
he did a bunch of shows. He did Redhead.
Yeah, Red. Okay.
And he was Fosse's guy before later. He was Fosse's guy in a
Right.
bunch of shows, and the movie of My Sister Eileen, and also
Eileen.
Ankles Away, where Don Pippin was his assistant.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
But let me tie something in for you.
Mm-hmm.
The restaurant, Chez Odette, was in New Hope, Pennsylvania, where St. John Terrell's Lambertville Music Circus was. One of the backers was Don Walker.
Oh.
The main conductor was Oscar Kasarin, whose two assistants were Don Pippin and John Candy.
Goodness. Wow. I feel like, yeah.
Yeah, it's just all the names you're mentioning, it all
the
ties
names.
in.
It all ties in. Well, I will mention, you mentioned My Sister Eileen. To me, one of the greatest dance arrangements of all time is, I'm not even sure it has a proper title, but it's known as the competition dance, and it's Fosse and not, is it Tommy Rawl? Tommy Rawl.
Yes. Yeah.
Basically, they don't sing in it, but it's backstage. They're basically outdoing each other, and any student of dance or dance music or any of that, that's like required viewing and listening, is the competition dance. And you see Fosse performing, and you see everything that I mean, many people are familiar with From This Moment On, Kiss Me Kate, which is the two that, which is the trio,
Mhm.
including Fosse. But when you see the competition dance, where it's just these two very athletic, very strong, and you see all of the way the music changes for them, and the way that it accentuates certain things and doesn't accentuate others, it's a brilliant lesson in dance arranging.
Uh,
So,
David, we're going to have to do another session where we talk about
okay.
other stuff. But this has turned into something I'm really thrilled about, which is talking about dance arranging. It wasn't our plan, but
It wasn't
we did
intended.
it.
Sorry. Yes. Okay.
But seriously, I want to do another one and talk about your career. Because we talked about how the career evolved. I'm quite serious. We'll do another one if you'd like.
Sure.
But this was fantastic, and there's some stuff here. We had so many crossing of paths between us, and of course, we've worked together a few times. Generally, because Doug Besterman called me to help him finish something, and it was something you had laid out. So it's and I have more to tell you about Peter Howard, which we will do.
Yeah.
But it's been great to talk with you about all of this stuff, and we should mention also that we are working together on an upcoming Sinatra musical, where we both participated for Kathleen and other people.
Yes.
But it's delightful to talk to you, and to be continued.
To be continued.
And I look forward to the next time. So
absolutely.
Everybody, thank you for listening, and more to come.
Absolutely. All the best.